תודה, יאללה.
Can I start?
Yes.
Okay, so hi everybody. My name is Boaz Ben David from the Interdisciplinary Center Herzliya, and I'm honored to present Professor Daniel Algom. Now, I'm not going to do the usual presentation as this is Danny. I'm not going to simply state that Daniel Algom did his PhD in Bar-Ilan University, moved to Yale for a postdoc with Larry Marks, where he met Wendell Gardner, which started a lifelong relationship between the two. I'm not going to say that Danny later returned to Yale for a few sabbaticals while taking on a position as faculty in Bar-Ilan and later in Tel Aviv University. I'm also not going to mention the impressive number of papers he produced and the volume of citation. I'm not going to mention his seminal works on the basics of cognitive science, rethinking the Stroop, the emotional Stroop, which is not a Stroop, by the way, and recently a review on the Gardner paradigm and a new book about the history of psychology. Instead, I'm going to say something personal. Danny was my PhD mentor, and I always regarded him as my academic father, for better and for worse, as I recall him asking me almost 20 years ago, how come I have not married that lovely young smart girl yet? I asked around with my fellow former Danny students, and it seems that we all feel the same, and we meet annually for the Algomia, and we celebrate Fechner Day together, and we feel like a family. Before this meeting, I asked some of my academic siblings, what is the common academic DNA that we inherited from Danny? We all agree that this is our feeling as a family and the connection we feel to each other. It is Danny's enthusiasm for the history of science and the historical origins of our discipline. Our students, his academic grandchildren, till this day, need to learn about the personal sleeping habits of Gustav Theodor Fechner. But maybe most importantly, it is his aspiration to always question and never take a study or a theory for granted. Even your own theories and even the Stroop phenomena itself, as you will hear in a minute, all of these have to be carefully examined. Before we start, don't worry, after she finally proposed, I married that lovely, smart young girl, and I have Danny to thank for it, or maybe to blame for it. So without further ado, Professor Daniel Algom, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Boaz, and organizer for inviting me for this talk today. I truly appreciate it. And a big thank you for all of you who involved in setting up this conference under the most difficult really circumstances. So chapeau, kol hakavod, kudos, you have it. And now to my talk. This talk will not be the usual talk. It will be fairly provocative. It's a conceptual critique, although sustained and supported by data. Okay, so first of all, good afternoon to everyone. And you will need every bit of my greeting, because I am going to challenge established dogma, questioning these deep-seated beliefs, popular axioms, you name it. Borrowing a line from Ibsen, the famous playwright from Norwegia, my talk goes against the so-called compact majority. So those of you faint-hearted, please take your pills now, so that you can attend with, open heart and mind. I hope everybody does. So look at the title. The title already tells it. Against the current zeitgeist and the huge literature are argued that control and conflict monitoring are fundamentally wrong for the Stroop effect, are fundamentally ill-suited, unsuited, even as a candidate theory for the Stroop effect. These are strong words, and I hope to convince you. But again, you need to exercise your faculty of open-mindedness, and in a moment, I tell you another word for it. So let me just say at this early point one thing about the conflict monitoring account. Well, this is a supposed brain mechanism which monitors incoming stimuli for conflict. Again, notice the word monitors. It monitors. It's on a minute basis, on a trial-to-trial basis. So if, for example, it detects a conflict stimulus, say a Stroop incongruent stimulus, then it immediately summons some central command of control, and this central command adjusts attention so that the person more narrowly focuses on the attribute of interest and is better equipped to ignore irrelevant distractors. So if another Stroop incongruent stimulus appears right after that, then performance is much better, supposedly because control has been exercised. By the same token, if the Stroop's experiment includes a disproportionate number of incongruent stimuli, then obviously you have a lot of control because control is summoned. Don't ask me which is the homunculus, the conflict monitoring or the control that it summons and how this central command is structured. But anyway, so if you have many incongruent stimulus in the stimulus ensemble of Stroop, then there is a lot of control. Then obviously attention is better focused on the attribute, on the relevant attribute. As a result, intrusions are minimized and the Stroop effect is small, because the Stroop effect, as you all remember, basically measures the intrusions of irrelevant distractors on performance. On the other hand, if the ensemble includes a disproportionate number of congruent stimuli, there is no conflict, and performance is prone to errors and so forth. But this should suffice for an appetizer, just to give you an idea of what control and conflict monitoring is all about. Okay, this is the second title of my talk, Ruin the Sacred Truth. Well, this is actually a title of a fellow faculty at my 6 or so years at Yale, Harold Bloom, an incredible literary figure, dead now. So again, if you wish another title for my talk, Ruin the Sacred Truth, I hope you can do it. Okay, and for those of you who know me well, I guess all of you say, well, there he goes again. Those who know, this slide is a joke. So sure, I do go there again. Yes, but this time is different. Well, every time is different. Okay, so let's proceed. Okay, you all remember Shakespeare, 7 Ages of Men. Well, I have here the 3 Ages of Stroop, and the dates are approximate, but just to give you an idea. So at 1935, J.R. Stroop published this article based on his doctoral dissertation, and silence of several decades follows. Let me just remind you the S.S. Stevens' celebrated Handbook of Experimental Psychology, which was published in 1951. It is a 1,500 volume book. Stroop is mentioned just once, and in a chapter on learning. But then came something from the early 60s to the millennium, really a second coming, a resurrection of Stroop. There, you know, the publication really went wild, and it became the single most popularly studied phenomenon in entire cognitive science. And then it was considered as the gold standard of attention, of selective attention. Actually, this term was suggested by Colin MacLeod, one of the former students of Stroop. It was really a gold standard as the title of his paper, and it appears in many of his papers. And then from 2000, from the beginning of the millennium, you have another huge literature in which the Stroop effect is conceived in terms of conflict monitoring and control. Well, my argument is that the Stroop effect had been hijacked by CMC, conflict monitoring and control, converted CMC. and it should be freed and brought back where it belongs. It's stimulus-driven attention and performance. Let me tell you, I return to this, but let me tell you this: stimulus-driven attention and performance explain all features of the Stroop phenomenon. So even by adopting Occam's razor, it's the preferred explanation. But I have more to say about this. Let me tell you about really how the grip on the field of this conflict monitoring control. I guess virtually all of you are familiar with paper by Bortwinick and colleagues. Conflict monitoring and cognitive control appeared in 2001, basically 20 years ago. This paper, along with two adjacent ones, already attracted over 30,000 citations. We are lucky that science doesn't go by, is not democratic. Even if 30,000 people tell you that 2 and 2 equal 5, it doesn't make it true. And the same thing is authoritative. But it's just to give you really the idea of how strong, how huge a literature we are meeting here. Again, it is against this tsunami that I argue. Conflict monitoring and control are fundamentally unsuited to serve as theories of the Stroop effect. Okay, let me say whence control? Why control was suggested for Stroop in the first place? Well, I think the idea is that in the Stroop task we have a near perfect errorless performance with the non-habitual response of color. So even when it conflicts with the habitual word. So this seems to indicate the operation of a central top-down control mechanism. So again, it's an extremely attractive idea. How can I perform so errorlessly in the Stroop? Perhaps there is a control, and control enables refraining from impulsive, automatic, or habitual responses, which in turn leads to this impeccable performance observed. Well, I question this is a very nice story, but I question its validity. Let me tell you this: control is not really necessary. Again, it would be absurd to deny control of whatever we do, but it's almost equally absurd to assume a dedicated central command system that adjusts behavior on a trial-to-trial basis in any particular task. You can suggest a similar mechanism for crossing the road or playing cards. It just doesn't stand to logic. A whole heavy-duty mechanism for performing in a task on a trial-to-trial basis. Again, simple perceptual input-driven stimulus factors can account for all future Stroop performance. I hope I can convince you of this. Again, so perception provides a complete and more parsimonious explanation of the Stroop effect. Okay, let me give you this. Let me issue a caveat, very important caveat. Please, everyone, I hope everyone understands. Control is a theory. It is an assumption. It is not a fact. Again, in many conversations with Posner, he says this. It is merely an assumption. It is not a fact. It is merely a theory. Otherwise, but many people take it for a fact. But if it is a fact, it's not like saying we have a brain or a head or something or a leg or. Now we all know that all too often popular terms in psychology taken for facts rather than for the notion they are. I won't expand on this, but think about the mental number line. All over the literature, you see this taken for a fact. It is a theory, and if you ask me, I think it's a bad theory, by the way. Attention spotlight. Posner suggested this as a metaphor. Then a esteemed colleague of mine measured the speed of attention spotlight, its width, and so forth. When people measure the physical properties of a metaphor. So again, the same thing is true of control. Many students take control for effects rather than for the theory it is. Now, well, many people say that this conflict monitoring control is associated with definite brain processes, in particular in the activity in the anterior cingulate context. Now, I'm really apprehensive about this because psychological processes that are not exclusively identified with a given brain reaction. It is very difficult. They don't come with a label. You know, if I detect a reaction in the ACC, it doesn't come with a label. Well, this is conflict. This is detection. This is decision. Any casual link must be supported by double dissociation. Now, this has been done, but not nearly to a sufficient extent in conflict monitoring control. And then another thing which many investigators say, it has not been tested against the natural life hypothesis that enhanced ACC is associated with generic types processes rather than risk conflict. On the rare occasion when it was tested, it failed the test. By the way, Yossi Tselgov with some colleagues made the same point like 3 years ago. So it is not, we don't really have anything, an exclusive association with whatever brain process we are observing with conflict. There is a much more basic condition, I won't expand this on this, which is called selective influence. It is extremely advanced method by which we dissociate reaction times for certain tasks through a range of RT inequalities and derivations. I won't get into this. I dealt with this in a couple of publications, but but this has not even been attempted. It is a notoriously difficult condition to establish, what is not even attempted within CMC. Now, I don't know if I have to really present this slide here. I only do it because it has been ignored in the control literature. As first of all, you all know Stroop effect is really the difference between the reaction type to color between incongruent and congruent stimuli. If you use neutral stimuli, you have Stroop effect. This is really the main message, is that algebraic sum of interference and facilitation. Now, if the Stroop effect is 0, it is clear that the task irrelevant dimension didn't intrude on the task relevant perception. There is no difference between incongruent and congruent stimuli. The larger the Stroop effect, the greater the failure of full exclusive attention to color. Okay, now one last word about this. What is really a Stroop stimulus? And this is very important. A Stroop is a very unique stimulus. It is simultaneously a physical perceptual construct and a logical semantic construct. There are no other such creatures, if you think. It is the intersection of sensory perception and logic, which probably extends an unabated popularity. Look at this Stroop stimulus. On the one hand, it is a perceptual stimulus, impinges on the sensory surface like all other. On the other hand, it is a logical thing because it's either congruent or incongruent. Its components are either compatible or incompatible. It is a unique creature, no other creature we know in psychology, which is a logical object. It is almost an oxymoron. We have object of perception. We have logic. All of us have studied logic, but this is the logical object. And this explains why it is, it's unabatedly attracting, fascinating researchers. Okay. Now, therefore, the distinctive feature of all stimuli is the presence of a logical relation between its constituent components. Think of this. Each and every structure is either congruent and incongruent. There is precluded any third possibility. Think about the original dimension of color and color. You cannot combine them other than producing a congruent stimulus or an incongruent stimulus. There is no. Then, as a result, Stroop stimulus always mandate semantic analysis. Other stimuli don't. If you look at this, if you look at my glass, it is a wonderful perceptual stimulus, but it doesn't mandate semantic analysis. Okay, and so far it was just it was a refreshing of really trivial points. But now I get to the essence of the talk, the 7 sins of control, vis-a-vis Stroop, obviously. Okay, and I am willing to take your reservation, question, whatever. Problem number 1, the CMC, the conflict control approach, lacks the demarcation of the Stroop stimuli, the putative target of its theoretic explanation. It treats non-Stroop stimuli on equal footing with Stroop stimuli. Think about this. It treats the word red and green on the same footing than a red triangle. Note, for a red triangle, you cannot even calculate the Stroop effect because it lacks the quality of congruity. A red triangle is not more nor less congruent and incongruent than a blue circle. You cannot calculate the Stroop effect. Yet this approach treats the two on the same footing. What it does, it imputes conflict to non-Stroop stimuli when none exists, and where the Stroop effect cannot even be computed. B'kitzur, the lack of this demarcation alone challenges CMC as a bona fide Stroop theory. Let's get to the second problem. This approach ignores the unique cognitive processes of Stroop stimuli. Again, recall, for the Stroop logical relation to exist, one dimension must at least be semantic. Think of the stimulus that I presented at the outset. Of course, color is non-semantic, it's just a physical stimulus. But the word is semantic, it has a reference. So for the Stroop logical relation to exist, one dimension at the least must be semantic. So the processing must be semantic. Now think about a triangle in red. They are merely two physical components, and purely physical stimuli do not mandate logical or semantic analysis. And again, for the Stroop stimuli, semantic analysis is simply it's essential. Just to notice that the current stimulus is congruent, one must analyze semantically the task irrelevant stimulus to see if it matches or mismatches the congruence. So always you have semantic analysis. Okay, problem I see it's very easy. The effect of facilitation is anathema, is anomaly for the control approach. It cannot treat it. Recall, the Stroop effect is the sum of interference and facilitation. Now, facilitation is anathema to CMC. The whole control and the conflict approach is predicated on interference, on conflict. Whereby, if you look at the literature, Stroop effect and Stroop interference are used very interchangeably, as this is just a false identity. Let me make this point even more pointedly. The Stroop effect can be produced fully or in part by facilitation, without conflict at all. As just I just collected here a couple of papers from a vast literature. Facilitation can be as large as interference, can be larger than interference, and the entire Stroop effect can be facilitation. Control approach cannot even approach such the Stroop effect. No conflict. This was, by the way, demonstrated recently by my former student, now professor of mathematical psychology, Ami Eidels. I guess many of you know him. Again, another word, again, Stroop stimuli assumed in that approach to generate conflict and interference. However, in the same stimuli generate facilitation rather than interference, the whole approach is called into questions. And another thing, virtually all controlled studies of Stroop did not use neutral stimuli. So you could not partition the Stroop effect into interference and facilitation. In the absence of partitioning, all the effects attributed to interference and conflict and control might be actually those of facilitation. Okay, let's move on to the problem number 4. It refers to the major manipulation of conflict monitoring and control. The major manipulation, as I mentioned already, is percent congruent. The number or percent of congruent or incongruent stimuli in the Stroop experiment. Changing the PC, percent congruent, typically 80% incongruent. Typically, these are the typical means of creating conflict and control. Now, what is ignored, and it is perhaps one of the worst sins of this approach, that the same manipulation automatically creates color-word correlation or word response correlation within the same stimulus ensemble. Again, the moment you depart from a random allocation of words and colors, you create a correlation. So these stimulus factors of correlation has nothing to do with top-down control, but they generate all the effects that are misattributed to conflict control. Well, my friend Bob Bellara and other colleagues mainly pursue the color-word correlation. Others, James Schmidt, if you happen to know his name, mainly pursued word response correlation, but the results are the same. Let me say a word on this for that you. Please look at this innocuous Stroop matrix. It is really anatomy of the Stroop experiment. This is basically the point of departure of control studies. They can consider this like no control, and then from this matrix they create a lopsided matrix of 80% incongruent or 20% incongruent. So in this particular matrix, notice please that percent congruence is 50%. We have as many congruent as incongruent stimuli, namely 36. The congruent stimulus are along the, you see the negative diagonal, and all the off diagonal all cells are incongruent stimuli. The numbers here is the frequency of presentation, and you see this is basically 90% of all published Stroop studies. Now, if you look carefully, you will notice that this metric is not so innocuous. Actually, if you create a correlation, a nominal correlation, if you calculate chi-square and calculate the correlation, you have a sizable correlation 0.25 between color and word. This is fatal for selective attention because if the subject attends to the nominally irrelevant dimension of attribute of word, he can predict the response better than chance. Now, if you consider the lopsided matrices used in the control approach, the correlation is amazing. So basically the Stroop effect is jeopardized by the correlation introduced into the design. So think about it is an extremely powerful. It's a powerful factor. The Stroop effect measures the intrusion of the task relevant word on performance color. But if the word helps you to predict the task relevant color, then you use it, and by virtue of this fact, your selective attention fails. Please take a look at the power of correlation. Well, some years ago, Bob and I collected scores of Stroop statistics in the literature, and then set up a matrix of their design, like what I have just shown you, and then plotted the Stroop effect reported in the study against the correlation unwittingly introduced by the investigator to the design. Lo and behold, we found a staggering 0.7 correlation. It's amazing. This means that half of the variability in published Stroop studies in the literature are explained by this correlation in the design. I tell you a secret. I usually, when I read a Stroop paper, before consulting the results, I look at the design. And in virtually all cases, I can skip the results because the correlation, the investigator inputs into the design, it produces your results. So it's an extremely powerful variable. Now, in the control literature, there is a difference between two conditions. When there is a disproportionate number of incongruent stimuli in the design, the Stroop effect is small. When there is a disproportionate number of congruent stimuli, the Stroop effect is large. It is easily explained, but I don't have really time to enter those there. In the mostly congruent condition, you have a large, very large color over correlation, as we've just seen. This diverse attention to the task irrelevant word due to its particular, a large Stroop effect ensues. In the most incongruent condition, you have the same correlation, but because the Stroop object is such a semantic object, there is a clash between color and word, and that clash reduces the effect of correlation. There is another explanation based on word response correlation by James Schmidt, which is possibly even simpler than what I am suggesting here. But the main point is that this has nothing to do with conflict and control. It explains in exemplary fashion all facets of the Stroop experiment. Problem number, what problem we are? 5? Okay. Here is another problem. I believe it's equally fatal for the control approach. The control approach, perhaps due to its stress on central command and control, overlooks the simple physical makeup of the stimuli. The hue, saturation, color, saturation value of the colors presented, or the font size, location, visual angle of the words. Now, my research shows that actually it was Garner, my dear friend and one-time teacher at Yale, who first reported this. The simple physical makeup of the stimuli determines the Stroop effect. It is precisely the physical makeup. So let me spend a word on this. So the Stroop effect is determined by the relative salience of discriminability of the colors and the words. The more salient dimension, typically the word, interferes performance with the less salient dimension. Please consider this. Suppose you present the subject in a pretest with words in uniform black and measure the time they discriminate the words. This is a one-dimension task, no conflict, just the words differ. Then you present the subject with another baseline one-dimension task, the same word in different colors. So the subject just identifies the colors. Chances are that the task with the word is way easier than the task with the colors, and so is performance. The reason is simple. In the 800 years since the press was invented, basically our characters are made to be highly discriminable. So when people do Stroop experiments, they simply download the font, they download the palette of colors, they combine them. By doing so without any precaution, they make the word way more discriminable than the color. Let me tell you an anecdote. I give such talks all over the globe, and I don't remember a case when someone or another didn't approach me after the talk and told me, oh, Professor, and with much trepidation, I once did the Stroop study, but didn't find anything. Well, my response, you did it correctly, you did it right, because you were careful to match the baseline discriminator of 2 dimensions. As simple as that, what we ask our first year students to do in introductory course, class on research methods. So look at this. If you can do this simply in an experiment. Actually, the first person to do this was Stroop, J.R. Stroop himself in 1935 in grossly underreported experiment number 3. So if you just do what I just told you, download a font and the color, chances are that the word I way more in the left-hand panel, way more discriminated the color, and you get a decent Stroop effect. But if you take a precaution, which all students do in their research method class, that the Stroop effect evaporates. Again, you don't impair perception. You make the colors equally salient like the words by a simple pretest. And when you make the colors more salient to the eyes than the words without impairing legibility, you get a reverse Stroop effect by which the colors intrude on the words. Now consider, in all 3 conditions, you have the same number of conflict stimuli. I cannot stress this enough. You have the same number of conflict stimuli, and yet in one case you get a Stroop effect, in one case a 0 Stroop effect, in the third case you have a reverse Stroop effect. This is inconsistent with any conflict. It's the same conflict stimuli one time produced conflict, one time don't produce, one time misproduce. Well, you name it. It is. Let me just show you the power of relative salience. Bob and I, again, took a scores of Stroop studies from the literature and calculate that when possible, the baseline word color difference. How do we do this? Many Stroop studies have neutral stimuli. For example, the word table in different colors. So you have a color baseline. And in a similar fashion, you sometimes have a word baseline. So we plotted the Stroop effect reported against the baseline salience, discriminator of word and colors. And we got a staggering 0.80 correlation. Think about this. Just the factor of relative salience explains over half of the variance in published tool results. By the way, just these 2 contexts, correlation and salience, have a multiple correlation of 0.9 with the published Stroop effect. So over 80% of the variance in the published Stroop effect are explained by just these 2 contexts. These contexts have nothing to do with conflict and control. And I don't bother you with further context, which explain nearly all of the Stroop effect. Okay, let's go to, now I am approaching the end. I hope you still have energy. This is really something easy. Most control studies use the Stroop task for no other reason than to generate conflict. And a sure sign is that in many studies, the Stroop effect is not even calculated or reported. How can such an approach can serve even as a candidate of a Stroop effect? The Stroop effect is not reported. What they report is the reaction time for an incongruent stimulus, for the next incongruent stimulus, all sorts of reaction time, but not the Stroop effect. Okay. The last problem, there are more problems, but the last one of this talk is the so-called Graton effect. again, I mentioned this at the outset. The reaction time to the second incongruent stimulus is faster in an incongruent sequence than in a congruent incongruent sequence. Well, the reason, according to the conflict monitoring approach, is that the first incongruent stimulus summons control, so the second incongruent stimulus really performance improves due to this control. So it's better than in a sequence congruent incongruent sequence. So this is the Graton effect. And the Graton effect, along with the PC effect, is cited as the strongest piece of evidence supporting the conflict monitoring and control approach. However, this approach is already inconsistent with major empirical features of the Graton effect itself. In a moment, I show you, just I don't have time. First, according to CMC, the conflict monitoring approach, the Graton effect is stimulus independent. So look at these two sequences. At the left hand, you have an incongruent stimulus followed by an incongruent stimulus, but it's complete repetition. So the performance with the second stimulus is better. But now look at the right, you have an incongruent stimulus followed by another incongruent stimulus. But here nothing is shared between the stimuli. Now, according to the conflict monitoring approach, it is the presence of conflict that is critical, not the means of producing it. It should be stimulus independent. It is not articulate, but this is a basic, but data show that it is not stimulus independent. In the sequence at the left, the facilitation is much greater than in the sequence in the right. So the explanation fails even here in the Graton effect. Let's take just a second thing. It is also another assumption is that it is task independent. Again, it is the conflict which counts, not how it is generated. So look here, at the left you have two incongruent Stroop tile, a Stroop incongruent tile, and another Stroop incongruent tile. Then at the right you have a Stroop incongruent and then a Simon incongruent tile. Well, much data shows that either there is no facilitation at the left hand or much less facilitation than at the right hand than in the left hand. So the conflict monitoring is not task independent, violating basic assumption of this approach. And the third one is even more surprising. The Graton effect talks about incongruent sequences, but you notice the same effect with congruent sequences. The performance of the congruent stimulus is also better after you experience a congruent stimulus. Now, congruent stimulus don't contain any. There is no conflict. So again, even with the Graton effect, this approach fails miserably. Okay, let's get to the end of the talk. The last temptation of control, or if you will, the worst sin. And again, please, I hope you are you are still with me. And the worst thing is corrupting the very notion of conflict. The approach is called conflict monitoring, conflict all over the place. But what they really discuss and model is not conflict at all. Look, I have only time to mention here the highlights. Conflict in psychology and in logic refers, take any dictionary, scientific or general, is opposing mutually exclusive responses. For those of you who studied logic, recall the law of non-contradiction. It's mutually exclusive responses. In psychology, is opposing responses. The mere availability of multiple alternative responses does not ipso facto render them conflicting. The responses need to be opposing or semantically or exclusive logically to be conflicting. Now this whole approach ignores this delimitation. So it distorts conflict beyond recognition. So in CMC, where there are multiple responses, virtually always there is conflict. I ask everyone who is sitting on your roots, just look around in your room. Every stimulus you see is a conflict stimulus, because there are every multi-dimensional stimulus is a conflict stimulus because there are potentially multiple responses. And this distortion of this central psychological notion is what is modeled in Monica. So Botvinnik et al. And others did model something. Well, I want to be polite, so likely valuable. But what they modeled was not conflict in any ordinary sense of the term. I just look at Botvinnik's pioneering study. You will be hard pressed to find a definition, but I did. So what they say, conflict may be operationally defined as the simultaneous activation of incompatible representations, e.g. of alternative responses. Not the false identity. Alternative equals incompatible. But this is simply not true, not in logic and not in psychology. Subsequently, this approach becomes even worse. Again, I don't know how many of you who are not into this modeling business have read Jung, Botvinnik, and Cohen, and all the others, but then conflict is distorted beyond everything you know. Any sensory, motor, or cognitive activity affecting response time. It can comprise noise, fluctuation of attention, response bias, even one-dimensional variable signals. Where is conflict? So it is simply defies. Okay, here is. I hope those of you who are still not convinced see the absurd yourself. Look at the modeling again. I appeal to those of you who are prepared to look at the actual model of Botvinnik, at the computational modeling. I entered this field a few years ago. So, but I ask everybody. So in this model, Stroop congruence will also conflict stimuli. This is conveniently underreported or ignored, but this is part and parcel of Botvinnik model. Now look here that both components support the same single response. How on earth this can be a conflict stimuli? But in this distortion of psychology and logic, this is a conflict stimuli. Okay, you can ask me. I now preempt your question. So if this is so long, how this approach still models successfully Stroop phenomena? So I think its success is grossly exaggerated. It's not an unmitigated success at all. Most of this modeling rests on data from non-standard design. I don't have time to enter into this. They put congruent stimuli and incongruent stimuli into different blocks. They use very small numbers of stimuli and endless violation. Okay, one example. In one well-cited study, participants are told the next stimulus will be incongruent. And this is what it's modeled. You understand? They jeopardize the whole reason, the answer of the Stroop effect by telling the subject in the next trial to attend to the word. So there are many violations and poor designs. Now, even if we ignore the first point of the wealth of Stroop phenomena, only PC and Gretton are models, and many other phenomena are not modeled at all and ignored. These people are really ignorant of like half a century or 3/4 of a century of Stroop research. So my conclusion is that the models were Stroop and good, but what is good is not Stroop, and what is Stroop is not good, and better explained by stimulus-driven factors. What I and McLeod and Bob Millar and others really unearthed. Okay, here is the final note regarding control. I searched for the elimination of control. Never found it. None of the investigators ever described something that is preempted from control, that is free of control. It reminds me of this Russian saying, excellent saying, if everybody cheats, nobody does. Well, I know this in person from my childhood in Budapest. So if everybody cheats, nobody does. But if everything is controlled, no thing is. A useful scientific construct should delineate also what is not included. But control is all over the place. It's like saying you have a brain or a head, like Posner told me innumerable times. So again, in conclusion, again, remember my fellow faculty at the time, Harold Bloom, ruined the sacred truth. Again, the factors unearthed by McLeod and scores of others better explain the Stroop effect by bottom-up stimulus-driven processes. Top-down influence is redundant and not parsimonious. It's simply a bad theory for the Stroop effect. Okay, let me just thank, I was really very selective. There are scores of friends and students, colleagues, both in Israel and abroad who helped me in this, but for this last enterprise I just named, Danny Fitoussi, Eran Chayut, my long-term collaborator and friend, and Werner Chakuf, and all of them really, thanks are due, all of them, and thank you for attending and listening. I don't know if we have time for questions, but I'm willing to take some if
Let's see if we can. Let's see if we can, Danny. So thank you very much, Danny, for the talk. If you want to raise your hand electronically so we can decide who asks the first question. Jonathan, did you want to make a comment?
I always want to make a comment, but the other people who raised their
Boaz, I guess I convinced everyone, so there are no questions.
No,
the other people who raised their hands before me.
Since I have some technological issues, you start now. Try to find who are the others. Go ahead, Jonathan.
Okay, I just really enjoyed the talk. You hit another ball out of the park, as I wrote to everyone. I was just curious. I don't know if Asher is still here. He gave a fantastic talk yesterday, talking about tip of the tongue. And the first part of his talk, he talked about how much of tip of the tongue is stimulus driven. So you've got stimuli for which you are able to exert tip of the tongue very easily. It has to do with perceptual factors rather than with top-down factors. And I would love to have like somebody put this together for me. Is this very similar or not? I don't know if Asher is still here or not. Don't know if you heard Asher's talk, but there's such similarities between the two talks.
Thanks a lot, Jonathan.
Toda.
Maury, do you agree with everything?
What should I say? Excuse me. Of course. I wonder whether if the conflict monitoring literature was just to remove the name Stroop from all that they do, would you still agree that the conclusions that they're reaching are valid? Because some of your criticisms I thought were, using the name Stroop in vain, in a sense. But then the question is whether substantively, okay, let's say they're not Stroop stimuli, and they're what they call a Stroop effect is not always purely a Stroop effect. But the question is, to what extent are again, are their conclusions that they're reaching valid in terms of the theory and concepts that they're using?
Okay, let, let me put it this way. To be on a conservative side, maybe these notions are useful in other domains of cognitive psychology. I'm not convinced, but they're completely wrong vis-a-vis Stroop. So it is not just a name. A lot of features, I mentioned some, that there are many others that they simply cannot explain, or their explanation go against the data. So it's much worse. The situation is much worse than you allude. So it might be useful concept for other domains of psychology, but this is very interesting because they, for some reason, they elected to use Stroop as their main device of testing, but for no good reason. So I believe that, but this is completely wrong theory for the Stroop effect. So I hope to how should I put to return to reclaim Stroop back. And I am still a minority. I am an iconoclastic person, if you well know, but there are very important persons, I won't mention their name, who share my views, and we hope to reverse somehow the tide. I'm not sure of that.
You certainly gave us a lot to think about, but it'll take a while to think about it.
Thank you.
So we have one more hand raised. Go ahead, Nuri.
Hi. Okay. Danny, thank you for a wonderful talk.
Thanks a lot.
I have a question that I predict your answer, but still I want to ask it.
Sure.
To what extent is the argument that it's all about dimensions, right? The dominance of the dimensions and the conflict, to what extent are they really mutually exclusive? I mean, can they both contribute to the Stroop effect? So
what
once you have...
You mean congruent and incongruent, or what do you mean?
What I mean is, your argument is that when you have one very dominant dimension, right?
The salience. One dimension is more
very
salient than
the other one. Yes, and then you get the inverse Stroop effect, for instance, when you have the color more dominant than the words, right?
Let me remind you, Stroop did this in the first person to demonstrate a reverse Stroop effect was Stroop himself. I asked everyone to look at your Stroop of 1935. Experiment 3 did just that. When the colors were, he did this by other means, I don't enter to this, but basically the colors were more salient than the words. They intruded in the words. Now,
yes. So my question is, but doesn't this saliency cause or elicit the conflict? So this is like the baseline of
the conflict is logical. The conflict is logical. It's not nothing. You have a logical conflict. When the color mismatches the word or vice versa, you can call it a conflict. But again, now whether there will be a Stroop effect or not, it depends on the relative discriminability of the thing.
Yes.
Now,
okay.
But if I want to be really precise, I say that the more discriminant dimension intrudes on the less, more than vice versa. Maybe the less also intrudes, but much less than the other. And this was demonstrated by Garner himself. I don't know if you know, you happen to know Pomerantz by chance? Pomerantz demonstrated this also. These are the pioneers, but many other investigators since.
Okay, maybe we have time for the last question. Maury, go ahead.
Sorry, I took up two, but your answer to Nuri just raised another point that had occurred to me before, which you said you're defining conflict logically, and that's fine. So this is another, maybe I'm trying to somehow save the conflict monitoring conception. So if they were just to call it potential interference monitoring rather than conflict monitoring. So you're monitoring the potential for something to interfere with your intended goal. it may not be a logical conflict in the sense that you're defining, but it's interference monitoring. And would that help save some of it?
No, it doesn't help because they distort the very concept of conflict. How do they explain the Stroop effect that produced by facilitation, for example? The whole Stroop effect is facilitation, no conflict, no interference.
But let's say that the goal of this literature is not to explain the Stroop effect, but it's to study how people deal with interference, potential interference, and try to keep their cognitive processing on track.
Mori, you are right, but the Stroop effect is not just interference, it's facilitation. All of it might be facilitation.
I understand.
And there are other points also. It doesn't, correlation and salience explain this much better than, you don't need all this heavy duty machinery in the Stroop. Maybe other point is, so it cannot be reconciled, but I understand, I appreciate your point. But it's difficult.
So, I think this
a lot of people have a lot of things to say to you later.
Yeah, I think this debate could go on. Let me thank Daniel Algom for another fascinating talk. And let me remind you all, we meet again in 25 minutes for Ruti Kimchi's talk. Hi, Ruti. So see you in 25 minutes. Go and have your coffee break. See you at the cafeteria.
Thank you, Danny.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Danny.
Oh, thanks a lot. ליאור?
כן, היה מאוד מעניין.
שומעים אותנו כולם פה?
כן, נראה לי שכולם.
כולם שומעים אותך, אין סודות בחברה.
כל החברים פה, לילך,
נחמד לראות אנשים שלא ראיתי מלא זמן.
רגע, אם כולם שומעים אותי, אז מגיע איזה שאפו גדול ללילך. היא קיבלה פרופסור מן המניין באוניברסיטת תל אביב.
וואו.
ואל תשאלו מי השם.
דני, הייתה יופי של הרצאה.